In the autumn of 1878, an Arkansas farmer was plowing a dry creek bed when his blade struck something solid. Expecting a root, he instead unearthed a Sharps carbine, a military-issue rifle with a stock blackened by old fire and a barrel warped by heat. It was wrapped in the decaying remnants of a cotton sack, and along its inner seam, stitched in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of those names matched federal death warrants filed at the Fort Smith courthouse. The other 2 had disappeared from every official record in the Indian Territory, as if they had never existed. The farmer brought the rifle and the sack to the federal marshal that same day. Within 48 hours, the rifle, the farmer's statement, and the last name on the sack, underlined 3 times, had all vanished. For nearly a century, historians refused to acknowledge that the final name belonged to a woman. When the truth finally emerged in 1962, hidden in a court clerk's private letters, it carried a detail so disturbing that the Arkansas Historical Society voted not to publish it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we continue with the story of the woman the Choctaw Rhodes called Ninyihi, meaning sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the frontier, whose name made outlaws flee to Mexico. Please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel. To understand what this woman did, and why the records are so deliberately broken, you have to understand the world she operated in. After the Civil War, the land between the Arkansas and Red Rivers was not a state. It wasn't even, in any real legal sense, America. It was the Indian Territory, a vast expanse that now forms eastern Oklahoma, set aside for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced removals of the 1830s. Because it wasn't a state, state law didn't apply. Tribal courts only had jurisdiction over their own citizens. That meant any non-tribal member, deserter, killer, thief, could commit murder in broad daylight and walk away unpunished. Outlaws had known this since the war's end. By 1870, the territory had become North America's largest sanctuary for fugitives, 70,000 square miles, sheltering an estimated 20,000 white criminals. The only law that followed them was the U.S. Marshal Service, riding out of Fort Smith under Judge Isaac Parker, the aging judge, who would sign 79 execution warrants over 21 years. Parker relied on about 200 deputy marshals, and beneath them, freelance bounty hunters paid by the body. Most were former Confederate cavalrymen, freedmen, Cherokee veterans, or ex-outlaws who had cut deals. The average bounty hunter lasted 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a decade, and almost all of them were men. The woman the Choctaw called Nanny didn't fit any of those categories. She was born into slavery around 1840 in Mississippi. She escaped in the fall of 1864, while Sherman's army was far to the east. She crossed the Mississippi on a stolen flatboat that winter, and by 1869 she was living alone in a cabin on the Choctaw, Arkansas border. With a Sharps carbine across her knees, 2 Remington revolvers in a flour sack, and a leather cord around her neck strung with 7 bone beads. Her name on the Carrick plantation ledger was Hester, no surname. She was 13 when she was listed as a field hand at 400. She was 24 when the ledgers stopped being kept in the summer of 1864. Because the owner fled south, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gossett. Gossett was a small, red-haired man with a quiet smile and a habit of cruelty. He kept a pack of dogs trained to catch runaways and a whip he called the preacher. He also kept a private ledger of punishments. Hester's name appeared there more than any other. The ledger was burned in 1865, but we know this from the testimony of her half-sister, Rhoda Green, who spoke to a WPA interviewer in 1937. On a September night in 1864, after Gossett had 3 men flogged, including Hester's brother, Cass. She waited until the moon was obscured by clouds. She removed her shoes to move silently, walked barefoot to the main house, and entered Gussette's bedroom. What she did there, the WPA transcript only hints at. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. She then broke the lock on the corn crib, carried her brother out on her back, and laid him under a pecan tree. She took Gussette's revolver, boots, and horse and rode north. By dawn she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the next night, she had reached Union lines outside Vicksburg. A corporal's letter described her as a calm woman on a fine horse, saying her name was Hester, that she was 24, and that she wasn't going back. That letter is the first document where she appears as a free woman, and the last where she uses that name. She moved north with supply trains, working for food and shelter. By winter 1865, she reached Cairo, Illinois, where she worked as a laundress and, according to quartermaster records, served as an unpaid scout for a Union cavalry detachment under Captain Winthrop Haight. Haight's diaries mention her briefly. She brought in 2 deserters unassisted. She could read sign like scripture, and when the war ended, she asked to be released. She told him she was going after Gussette, who had survived, she'd learned, and was now operating in the borderlands under a false name. Haight tried to talk her out of it. She listened, thanked him, and walked out into the cold gray light. He never saw her again, which brings us to the Indian Territory and the 5 years between 1869 and 1874, the period about which we know both the most and the least, and by far the most disturbing things. During that time, a woman fitting Hester's description appeared repeatedly in Fort Smith court records, but always at a distance. She never testified, never signed anything, never collected payment in person. Her bounties were handled through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom. Over 5 years, she earned $4,060, a fortune, for the capture or killing of at least 31 fugitives. She operated alone. She changed horses frequently. She wore a black wool coat, a wide, brimmed hat, and heavy boots. Around her neck, under the coat, hung a leather cord with 7 bone beads. Rumors said the beads were for 7 men. She was still hunting. She turned the others in alive when she could. But when she found one of the 7, the body was never seen again. Only a filed bone bead was left behind. The first to fall was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech. His horse walked into a settlement 3 days after he disappeared, with a bone bead wedged into the saddle stitching. The second was Wiley Spann, a horse thief who had participated in selling 5 Carrick people south. He vanished from his cabin, his possessions undisturbed, with a bead and 5 names on a paper. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th fell in quick succession in 1872, each leaving a bead at the scene. Each had been present at documented cruelties against Hester's mother Temp. By early 1873, only 2 names remained: Abner Gussette and one other. The court clerk, Thaddeus Boole, wrote to his wife about an unsettling instruction from Washington not to issue any warrant for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property. Someone high up was afraid of what Hester would find if she kept riding in that direction. In the summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. Then, on October 14, a Creek officer rode into Fort Smith with a dispatch. Abner Gussette had been found alive, bound to a chair, with a note pinned to his shirt reading, "Not him alone," and a sketch of a bone bid unsmoothed. Gussette was tried, convicted on 4 counts of murder, and hanged on February 7, 1874. From the scaffold, he said, "She should have killed me herself, and the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was. You will never hang him. You will never even write his name down, because the people who own him own you." Hester began her final hunt. It would consume 15 months, cross 3 states, and lead to something she never expected. And to the truth the Arkansas Historical Society couldn't publish. The 7th name on her cord wasn't a name at all. It was a title Indian agent, the federal agent assigned to the Creek Nation between 1855 and 1861, whose duties included the return of runaway slaves. But he'd also run a private business, capturing runaways who had made it to the territory and selling them for profit in Texas and Arkansas. One of those people was Temp, Hester's mother. She had escaped from an Alabama plantation in 1853, walked west for 41 nights, and found shelter in a Creek freedman's cabin. She was free for 10 months. Then the agent hunted her down, put her in a wagon, drove her 180 miles, and sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold. 9 months later, Hester was born. 4 years after that, Temp was dead of fever, the records say, but witnesses later described something far worse. Hester had never known any of this. She believed her mother had been born and died at Carrick. She learned the truth in the summer of 1873 and went silent for 4 months. In December 1874, she found the agent living comfortably in eastern Arkansas under federal protection. A doctor was called to a boarding house to treat a man with a gunshot wound, and a ritual mutilation so distressing he wouldn't describe it in writing. The man died 2 days later. A sheriff's deputy instructed the doctor not to record the name. The boarding house register had the page torn out, but on the bedside table, the doctor saw a filed bone bead and a square of paper with a single word, Tempe. Hester was never arrested. No warrant was ever sworn. Officially, the man had never existed in Arkansas or the territory. His pension was paid to a P.O. box for another 16 years. Hester collected no more bounties. She bought 80 acres in western Arkansas, built a house, planted an orchard, kept bees, and sold honey. She lived alone until the 1880 census, which falsely listed her as unable to read or write, and then vanished from the records. She may have been buried in the orchard under the Methodist church that later took the land. We don't know. The cotton sack found with the rifle had 11 names stitched into it. 9 matched known fugitives she'd taken. The 10th was the agent. The 11th, stitched tighter, in a different shade, has never been identified. Some say it was someone she never found. Others say it was herself. The rifle itself vanished from federal storage in 1924. And then there's the final detail, the one the Historical Society couldn't publish. In 1962, an amateur historian traced the agent's great-granddaughter. She had a trunk in her attic. At the bottom was a cloth bag containing 14 locks of human hair, each tied with a colored ribbon, each labeled with a name and date. The 13th was Temp, dated November 17, 1854, 2 months before she was sold to Carrick. The great-granddaughter didn't know. When she learned what it meant, she took the locks to a small black cemetery in western Arkansas, where apple trees still grow. She buried them there, each beneath a flat stone, and asked forgiveness for the grandfather she'd never met, and the woman she'd only just learned of. The Historical Society voted not to publish the story. They didn't feel they could decide whether Hester had forgiven the agent, so they closed the file. We don't know if Hester ever knew about the locks of hair. We don't know if she ever understood, as she sat on her porch in the winters of her later years, that the thing she'd been hunting wasn't men, or names, or even justice, but the unbearable truth about the country she was born into. We can't know. We can only guess. And when we do, we carry the weight of everyone whose name never made it into a ledger, whose child never learned that their mother had once, for 10 months, been free. This story reveals something our official histories rarely admit, that when the law refuses justice, some people take it up in secret. It cannot be called justice in any clean sense, but it cannot be called anything else. The hunter and the hunted are not always morally opposed, and the woman who was once recorded as 400 of property became, in 1 decade, the most feared figure on the frontier, and then walked away to tend bees and apples. I'll leave you with this, when we're told records have been lost or files closed for historical delicacy. We should ask who had the power to decide what was recorded, and who has benefited from the forgetting. What do you think? Was Hester a murderer, a soldier, a judge, a prophet, or something we don't yet have words for? Should the Historical Society publish the name after 150 years? Leave a comment. I read every one. If this story moved you, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with someone who believes the dead still have claims on us. I'll see you in the next video.